Hello class, welcome back to another English 370 lecture. As always, we've got another good one coming your way. Today we are talking about sociolinguistics. Now, if I sound a little bit rehearsed today, a little bit grumpy, it's because it's a little late right now. It's a really nice day out, although it started raining. And I just recorded the first 15 minutes of this lecture and lost it. Well, I thought I was recording it, but I didn't take, so if I seem downtrodden, it's not the topic sociolinguistics. I actually love sociolinguistics. I am a sociolinguist by trade, but rather being a little frustrated on a Monday evening, Tuesday evening. Can't keep track of days anymore. Anyway, we're talking about sociolinguistics today. We had been talking about historical linguistics for the past few classes, and that was fantastic. We got to a fairly good wrap-up point. Though, as I mentioned in the last lecture, there is more to be covered there if you guys are interested. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to, when we talk on Friday in our in-person synchronous class, I'm happy to talk more about historical linguistics there, and we can tie up some loose ends. And we can also take a quick poll and see what you guys would like to talk about for the rest of the semester. The nice part about the way that this course structure works is that we've got a little extra time built in. All right, so we've already covered what's largely considered to be the core of linguistics. Those are the things that we did at the beginning, like phonetics and phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. That's largely the core. And moving forward here, we can have some fun. These are often fun topics now that we have our foundation set. And we also have a little more wiggle room. If we want to spend more time talking about a certain topic, be that historical or psycholinguistics, computational forensic linguistics, whatever it is, I'm happy to take some direction and talk about what you guys are interested in. I obviously have things planned, things that I'm going to talk about in a vacuum, but it doesn't have to be a vacuum. So that's a heads up. If you're watching this, you can start thinking about what you might want to spend some more time learning about. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. Okay, that's enough preamble. Let's talk about sociolinguistics. So in order to get at sociolinguistics, first we need a few concepts. And the first one we're going to come across is the idea of linguistic variation. And this is something that you guys are actually very aware of, whether you know it or not. You've had this realization that, like, people speak differently around the world, right? When you come into contact with people from different areas of the United States, different states, they speak English differently. Sometimes even within Michigan, people speak English differently. This is intra-language variation, right? We're talking about variation within a single language now. So we're not talking about comparing the differences between English and French. We're talking about looking at linguistic variation amongst English speakers. There's some really cool demonstrations of linguistic variation, a few of which we'll be talking about in Friday as well. These little like questionnaires, quizzes and surveys that ask you questions like the following, for instance, right? Like you can think to yourself behind your computer as you watch this on YouTube right now, what do you call a small insect that comes out typically on summer evenings, and their rear ends light up and flash with a kind of yellowish light? These are a certain type of insect that come out. I'm obviously not saying the name of this insect because that would give away what I call it. So think, you can even say it out loud again because you're watching on YouTube. Nobody will make fun of you. Maybe your dog. What do you call that? You could have, there's a couple possible answers. There's many possible answers here, but primarily there's probably going to be a split amongst you, whether you call this thing a firefly, which is what I would call it, a firefly, or whether you call it a lightning bug. And largely, so here we have an example of linguistic variation, right? Some people call this a firefly, some people call it a lightning bug, and there's probably some people who could use both interchangeably. And a lot of what that has to do in this case, what determines that linguistic variation, that variant, which one you use, lightning bug or firefly, is largely where you're from regionally. It's a geographic distribution issue there. So that's just a kind of not super impactful, but still a good demonstration of linguistic variation. People use language differently. And here what we have an example of is lexical variation, right? We actually have a totally different word for what the name of that bug is. And we find this kind of linguistic variation not just amongst words, lexical variation, like firefly versus lightning bug, but we find it all across the areas, the subdisciplines of language, all levels of grammar, right? So we find phonological differences based on where people are from. If you have the sentence, for instance, I have been talking a lot today, I have been talking a lot today. You can say, I have been talking a lot today, I have been talking a lot today, or if you're from across the pond, you might say, I have been talking a lot today, right? Been, and been for that word, which is spelled B-E-E-N. That's a phonological variation that we have amongst English speakers. We have lexical variation like we just looked at. We also have syntactic and morphologic variation, and semantic and pragmatic variation. We'll be talking more about these later on. I'm going to take a sip of water because I have been indeed talking a lot today. So, we got variation understood now. Like I said, it's a pretty intuitive concept because most of us are aware of these types of variation. And so sociolinguistics comes in and it wants to look at this linguistic variation. And it wants to look at this linguistic variation as it correlates to different social factors, right? That's why it's sociolinguistics. So sociolinguistics finds that this variation isn't randomized, but it's correlated or associated with different social factors, like where you're from, geographic regional differences, but also socioeconomic class and gender, race, sexuality, right? All of these different social dimensions that we keep track of, for better or worse, as people, are correlated and associated with different linguistic forms of variation, different ways of speaking, to put it pretty bluntly. And that's what sociolinguistics is interested in studying, this connection between linguistic variation on one hand and social factors on the other hand, and the links between them. So there's two components there, right? A linguistic variation and a social variation, social factor. That's what we're interested in looking at. The welcome to the wonderful world of sociolinguistics. In order to get into this a little bit more, to sink our teeth into it, we're going to take a closer look at an example and see kind of how sociolinguistics differs a little bit from the other subfields that we've been looking at. So here is a good example of an utterance. This is by a speaker, Ryan. This is hypothetical. So imagine in this hypothetical world, the speaker, Ryan, says the following utterance. So, Julian got in, eh? So Julian got in, eh? That's what he said. And we want to think about what sort of meaning we get from that utterance, right? What did you take away from that utterance? Now, to begin this process, we can think back to a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was, when we were looking at semantics and pragmatics. And we can think about the meaning of this sentence from different perspectives. Remember that we talked about there being a bunch of different ways we can think about meaning in semantics and pragmatics. So one meaning you might take away is sort of the truth conditional, propositional content of this sentence, which has something to do with Julian getting in. Again, presumably there to some sort of school establishment, like a college, university, or grad school, etc., something like that. That's one perspective we can have on meaning. It's kind of the more semantic, formal perspective on meaning there. We can also take a look at this in sort of context and what it's doing here, and we can see that maybe a bit more pragmatically or contextually dependent, this utterance is Oh no, oh, you didn't see that. It's inviting us to affirm or deny this proposition, right? It's asking. It's kind of a question and it's looking for confirmation. So Julian got in, eh? Perhaps Ryan has reason to believe that Julian got in, but nonetheless, it's still asking for this answer, a yes or a no, an affirmation or a denial. Another sort of meaning that this utterance is having, but there's more to it. We, as speakers of English, we get more out of this sentence than that. Right? We understand things about the sentence, and particularly the way this sentence is said. So Julian got in, eh? That tell us things, right? Probably saw me flash it on the screen. Oh, a terrible tragedy, but I'm not doing this again. This kind of utterance also tells us something about Ryan's Canadianness, possible Canadianness. Do we know for certain as a fact that Ryan is Canadian? No, but we might suspect from this utterance that Ryan is Canadian. Why do we suspect this? What is it about this utterance that leads us to believe that Ryan is in fact Canadian? It might not be obvious. Perhaps my voice acting isn't quite up to par here to make that as clear as it should be. But hopefully you picked up on this discourse particle a, right? And what it's doing here. It has this conventional meaning that, it's asking a question, the affirmation or denial, but it also is telling us something about the speaker, right? It's not about the propositional content. That's not the meaning that we're taking from that. But we're taking away something about the meaning of, not the meaning of, we're taking something away about the speaker themselves. And in this case, the fact that they may be Canadian. We can break that down and see how that works a little bit, right? Is that we associate this A at the end of sentence with Canadian speakers. We're aware of the fact that that's a feature of a Canadian dialect of English. It's a way that Canadian speakers talk. And so that when we hear it, our brains immediately go to, aha, perhaps this person has now used a feature that I associate with Canadian English. Perhaps they themselves are also Canadian, right? That's kind of the long form of what's going on there in our heads when we hear something like this. And this brings up a very important concept, which is called indexicality. Indexicality, which is that the use of these different linguistic variants, the use of linguistic structures in variation, has the power to associate or connect people with social categories. That's the basis of this sociolinguistics. And we're going to call that indexation. That A here, this discourse particle A, indexes or points to, you can think of it as, like using an index finger, it indexes or points to Ryan's Canadianness. The use of A indexes Ryan as a Canadian speaker, a speaker of Canadian English, right? That's indexicality, and that language has this power all the time, and we're constantly paying attention to these things. We're constantly hearing the linguistic variants that are going on, and we're understanding the associated indexicality of what it says about the speaker themselves. I wonder where they're from. Maybe they're from this. Maybe they grew up in this type of neighborhood. Maybe they're bilingual speakers of this other, right? We're always picking up on these different variants and associating them with social meaning, attaching social meaning to this linguistic variation. Cool. And this constant process of associating people, like doing this, hearing this variation and associating it with its social indexes, it can vary to the extent that it's a conscious activity. The amount that we're aware of this process varies, and that's what we're going to talk about now, right? So in this case, the use of this discourse particle A to index Canadian status is fairly well known. People are really aware of that connection, right? If you ask somebody, especially, sitting here in Michigan, Canada's right next door, if you ask somebody to sort of imitate a Canadian accent or what do you think of when you think of a Canadian accent? A is probably one of the first things that they're going to go for, right? There's other things they might talk about the about, what are you talking about? Or they might talk about lexical items like hoser or whatever, right? Like there's a bunch of these things that people are aware of, and they're aware of their connection to Canadian English. And these things we're going to call stereotypes for pretty obvious reasons, right? These are the stereotypes. Again, it doesn't mean they're not true. It doesn't mean that Canadian speakers don't say those things. And it doesn't also mean that they do say those things. This is about people's perceptions, that people perceive a connection between a certain linguistic variant like A and Canadianness. Two things are important here. One is the awareness here, that when we're talking about stereotypes, we're talking about things that people are aware of. The second piece that is really important, and we're going to come back to it over and over, is that people can have these stereotypes, and they can be real stereotypes regardless of the actual connection between the linguistic variant and the social meaning. What we're interested in are people's perceptions. So regardless of the statistical tendencies of people who say A and people who are Canadian, maybe those are high, in which case there's some basis for this stereotype, or maybe that's total made up nonsense by the media. That's also possible. Regardless, the stereotype exists. Regardless, A can still index somebody as a Canadian speaker, even if it's a not well-founded connection. We'll return to revisit that idea that these are perceptions, right? That may or may not be rooted in reality. So that's an important thing. So this is at the height, right? This is the types of things that people are most aware of, are these stereotypes. We can kind of go down the ladder and talk about different things, right? There's also, we can contrast these highly conscious, highly salient stereotypes with what we'll call markers, linguistic markers, which are things that essentially are just ratcheted down a notch. Speakers are less consciously aware of. They may be kind of conscious of them, maybe they're in the subconscious, but they're less conscious of these types of things. And then one further step down are indicators, which people aren't really aware of at all. Right? These are possible connections between, again, a linguistic variant and a social feature that may exist, and people may not be aware of them, which is kind of interesting. Linguists can study this kind of thing and say, aha, there is actually a statistical correlation between this particular phonetic variation and this particular socioeconomic class, but people may not be aware of it. Again, because a lot of this is about perception, not necessarily about reality. The take-home point here is that these connections between linguistic variants and social factors, they vary with regards to how aware people are of them, right? The actual terms here, stereotypes, markers, and indicators, I don't really care that much about. They're a bit dated at this point. You may still see them if you take further sociolinguistics classes, like the one that I teach in the fall, which you should. Or if you do any sociolinguistic reading, you might run into these, but I don't really care that you know exactly what these terms are. What I care about is that you understand the awareness distinctions, that some connections people are very aware of and some people aren't. All right. And that all three of these have the power to carry social information, right? That's kind of the idea behind this indexicality, that these different linguistic variations can index people as belonging to certain social categories. I'm Canadian, I'm gay, I'm rich, I'm black, right? All of these different social fields that people can be indexed as. All right. So for the rest of this class session, look at how I'm doing on time, 20 minutes in about, that's not too bad. For the rest of this lecture, what I want to do is I want to walk you through some kind of classic sociolinguistic studies so that we can see a little bit more in depth of how sociolinguistics is actually done, what this looks like. And I'm going to frame it in a certain way, right? So over time, sociolinguistics itself is actually a fairly recent subfield of linguistics, right? Sort of modern sociolinguistics kicks off in like the 1950s and 60s, which may sound like a long time ago, but it's really not, right? The people that were doing that work, that sort of ground-breaking work that we're going to be looking at some of today, people like Bill Labov, they're still alive and active today, right? That's all within a single human life. So it's quite recent. And over time, there's been quite a bit of change in how sociolinguistics was done. And in particular, we're going to be looking at sort of the history of sociolinguistics through three eras, right? We're going to look at three main eras or waves, they've been called, three waves of sociolinguistics. That's a term coined by Penny Eckert, I believe. I'm not actually sure if it's coined, but she uses it a lot anyway and has written about these three different waves of sociolinguistics. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the sort of core methodology that drove each wave of sociolinguistics, and then I'm going to talk about a study in some depth that exemplifies that wave, that era of sociolinguistics. Sweet. So let's jump on in. What better place to start when we're talking about this than the first wave? I'm sure you guys are shocked you thought I was going to start you with the second wave. So let's talk about first wave sociolinguistics. This is kind of the inception of modern sociolinguistics. And what people were doing during this time period is that they were looking at, again, these kind of one-to-one correlations between linguistic features and social features, which again, that's pretty basic. That's what I talked about as being the heart of sociolinguistics. But what they were looking at more specifically were linguistic features and how they matched up to these big, sweeping categories of pre-existing demographics, right? They were interested in linguistic variation with regards to variables like class, sex, ethnicity, age, right? Big demographics. And above all of those, the most important one that gets talked about a lot in these first wave studies is socioeconomic class. Socioeconomic class tends to be king. And people are really interested in this time in how linguistic variation is split based on socioeconomic class. An underlying concept, so that's one thing you need to know, is that it works in these big social variables like race and socioeconomic class. An underlying concept of this sort of wave of linguistics, of sociolinguistics, is the concept of the vernacular, right? And your vernacular is the way, I've heard it described before as sort of simply as the way you talk when nobody else is around, right? You're not being influenced by different social situations. So there's this idea of intra-speaker variation, that I actually speak differently, depending on my social context. I speak differently when I'm lecturing to you on YouTube than I speak to my family at home, than I speak when I'm playing soccer, than I speak, right? All these different social situations have an effect on how I speak. And the vernacular, is the way that I speak when nobody's looking. Right? And that's what these sociolinguists were largely interested in. They were interested in people's kind of home, language of the home, their vernacular, with the idea that you can change the way you speak in different social categories. Like I can, put on my interview voice to sound good and intelligent and smart or whatever I'm after, but that my vernacular never actually changes. This is a critical part, that your vernacular is stable essentially from birth to death. Right? So you're born, and those early formative years of learning to speak give you this foundation of a vernacular way of speaking that doesn't change regardless of what else happens in your life. And that's what they wanted to get at. What happens is that this doesn't give, it locks people in, right? Well, essentially what that's saying, pitched from a different perspective, is that that's saying that you have no agency over the way that you speak. You speak like the people that were around you when you were first born, and you're stuck with that. You have no individual agency to choose your own linguistic habits outside of kind of this putting on airs in interview settings idea, right? Your core way of speaking doesn't change. So there's two aspects of first wave sociolinguistics that we want to keep in mind. One, it works in big social strokes like race and especially socioeconomic class. And point number two, speakers have no agency, very little agency to change the way that they speak. I hope the word agency makes sense there. Agency is this idea of you having control. And in this concept of sociolinguistics and vernacular, you don't have any control, right? The way your vernacular is beyond your control because it's set for life. This is not what people believe right now, as we'll see as we update through the second and third wave linguistics. But it kind of was the underlying concept of the time, even if people weren't saying these things explicitly. So let's take a look at a study. We're going to take a look at this study, which is it's a super famous study. It's probably the most famous sociolinguistic study there are. It's called The Social Stratification of R in New York City Department Stores. But more colloquially, you'll hear it referred to as the fourth floor study, and we'll see why it's called the fourth floor study. This is a study done in 1966 by Bill Labov, and in this study, Bill Labov is investigating the pronunciation of R's, or after vowels, post-vocalic R. And what this is getting at is linguistic variation between dialects of English, those that pronounce an R, those we'll call the R full dialects, and those that drop the R out entirely. These are R-less dialects. Right, so if you say the word floor, some dialects don't pronounce that final R. Car, floor, guard, fourth. Car, floor. I can't do it. I'm too embarrassed on YouTube to even attempt that. Canadian A I can handle, but not this. I have a very R-full dialect. But you can imagine it. I'm sure you've heard R-less dialects before, in person and in media both. It's fairly common. So that's what was being investigated, this R-lessness versus R-fullness. Why was this selected as a dependent variable? Why were people interested in this? Well, one reason is that it's got a really cool history, right? Actually, R-lessness in these kinds of East Coast and South reflected ties with England. The R-lessness did. And this made it a high prestige feature, right? Dropping your R's was actually the higher prestige. It was desirable until about the 1950s, at which point R fullness became the prestige variant, which is where we are today. Generally, R fullness is seen as higher prestige, right? That's what you're going to use in your interview versus R-lessness. And so Labov's study wanted to see how this linguistic variant, R-lessness and R-fullness, wait, did I say that wrong? R-lessness and R-fullness correlated to social stratification, particularly looking at socioeconomic class. Right? So given that R-fullness is the higher prestige variant and R-lessness is the lower prestige variant, Bill Labov's hypothesis was that if we could have a socioeconomic scale, which had to do with social factors on one hand, that they would exhibit the higher prestige or lower prestige variant more based on where they stood on a sort of socioeconomic prestige rating, right? That people higher in socioeconomic status would use more R's. They would have the prestige R full dialect, where people low in the socioeconomic status would drop their R's a lot and use the R-lessness one. That's what he wanted. That was his hypothesis that he wanted to test. Whew, this is quite the build-up. I'm sure you're on the edge of your seats right now. Another reason to do it is that post-vocalic R's are very common, they're high frequency, and they're able to be measured really easily, so you can get good data. So how did Labov, speaking of this, always an interesting topic when we're talking about this study, how did Labov go about getting his data? What kind of data do we work with? Well, hopefully we don't work with data quite like this, because what Labov did is that he went to 3 different stores in Manhattan, and he spoke to the sales assistants then. And what he did is he ranked the 3 stores that he went to with regards to prestige and price, right? Roughly correlating them to socioeconomic status at the end of the day, right? That's kind of what price gets you. And listen, I know nothing about shopping, class, like nothing. So if these aren't accurate, well, blame Labov from the 1960s. But what he said was that Saks was the highest prestige, highest price department store. Macy's was the middle, and Klein's is the bottom. I honestly don't even know if these places still exist, but you'll have to take Labov's word for it. So he went to these places, which he ranked by socioeconomic status, and he would talk to a sales associate, somebody who worked there, and he would particularly ask a question, and he was trying to get the answer 4th floor. So for instance, he would already have known that men's clothing was on the 4th floor. And so he would go up to a sales associate and he would ask, excuse me, could you tell me where men's clothing are? Of course, the sales associate would then ask and say 4th floor, 4th floor, or, whatever else, and probably 4th floor. Maybe they would say just go upstairs a few floors, but largely they would answer 4th floor. Why did he want them to say 4th floor? Well, it's got actually 2 instances, if you didn't already catch this, of the post-vocalic R. Both 4th and floor have a post-vocalic R. 4th floor, right? It's cleverly done. It's cleverly done. Yeah, it's very clever. It's also very legal currently, because what he wasn't telling these sales associates as he was talking to them is that he was secretly recording them. He had like a little voice recorder on him, and he just didn't tell them. Pro tip for your sociolinguistic future: don't copy this methodology if you don't want to get a lot in trouble. It's not cool now, right? The participants that you're talking to for sociolinguistic studies, they have to be informed, right? You have to have consent for these kinds of things, which Labov didn't have. The 60s were a weird time. I wasn't there, so don't take my word for it, but apparently it was nuts. But regardless of how he got the data in a shady way, it's a cool design, right? Because he got this. So he would ask them for a question going back to it that would elicit this answer 4th floor, and he would pretend not to hear. So he would say like, oh, excuse me, I didn't catch that, and he would get people to say 4th floor again. So not only would he get more tokens, more repetitions of these post-vocalic R's, but he would get a distinction between people's sort of more casual speech, which was the first time he would ask it, and more careful speech, which is when they would repeat themselves and perhaps enunciate a little bit more, right, to ensure his understanding the second time, since he was apparently feigning deafness. So that's what he did. That's how he did. And the study shows, I'm going to speed up a little bit. We might only get through 2 out of the 3 waves, depending on how slow we are. This is the data, right? So what he found is, here's the percentages of sales associates who had some sort of post-vocalic R, some amount of R fullness when they would answer his question forcefully. 62% of Sachs associates had some degree of R fullness. 51% of Macy's associates had some sort of R fullness, and only 20% of clients. Is that what he predicted? Absolutely, right? Here, the higher prestige socioeconomic class is aligning with the higher prestige linguistic variant. R fullness in Sachs, R lessness in Klein's. It was exactly what it confirmed his hypothesis, so to speak. It confirmed his hypothesis. Now, class. Let us think of what some potential issues with Lebov's methodology are. Okay, I already told you the one. Don't just record people without telling them. Not cool. That's one problem. I want you to think, if you can, about some more potential pitfalls. What is potentially amiss with this study, do you think? Take a minute here, if you don't mind, pause this video and think about it. Think about Lebov's methodology, what he wants to be investigating, and how he went about investigating it. Okay, you're back now, you've paused the video and you've poked all kinds of holes in Lebov's methodology by now, I'm sure. So we're gonna go over. Unfortunately, this would be a good discussion point if I had you in person, but I don't. So I'm gonna talk about some. One problem here is a big problem here that you may have spotted is that he's assuming that the sales associates of each of these department stores correspond to the relevant socioeconomic class. Right, so he's assuming that sales associates that work at Saks are higher socioeconomic class than sales associates who work at Klein's. So there's a weird conflation here of the status of the employees and the status of the clientele. Right, so maybe it's a tenuous connection. It's already between the price of the store and the socioeconomic class of the clientele. That's not a very firm correlation. The price of the store versus the income level of the people who shop there. There's something there, right? Statistically, probably that bears out, but it's not quite as concrete as I would like it to be, so that's one problem. But the problem gets worse, I think, in that he's not even asking the questions to the clientele, but rather to the employees. And I'm a bit skeptical that there's a tight association between socioeconomic class of the employees and the stores that they work for. Again, it's possible that that might happen, but we don't really want to work in maybes with this kind of study. We'd like to know that, right? And he didn't know that when he was doing this study. It was an assumption. So that's one big problem. Any other big problems? Any other big problems? There's kind of one. Another one that we can talk about is the fact that Bill Lebov is a white guy. And we're foolish to think that that doesn't have any effect. He's a well-educated, he's a professor, right? He's a well-educated, high-prestige white male in America in the 60s. In the 60s, right? So we're foolish to think that that people that he was addressing spoke their vernacular to him, right? Remember that idea of a vernacular, the way people speak when you're alone? Yeah, when you're at work and you're talking to a ritzy old white guy, okay, he probably wasn't even old back then, he's old now. But anyway, a ritzy white guy, your speech patterns change. So he's not getting people's vernacular here. He can't, right? He just can't. In his defense, this is a very real problem. It's kind of, researcher bias here. It's a very real problem that a lot of different fields of research struggle with, is that the researcher themselves influences the situation too much. It's really hard to work around. And sometimes we just do the best we can, and our studies are a little biased, right? And we try to take that into account as best we can. So it's not super critical. I'm not trying to like lambaste Labov here. He's awesome and did some really cool studies, including this one. But it's something that we need to take into account. If that's a hole that you poked into Labov's methodology, great success. You're right. We can talk more about ways to get around this researcher bias, perhaps in a more discussion format in our synchronous class. We're moving on. So what do you think? What do you think? And this is just quick before we move on. We're spending a lot more time here on this first study than we probably are going to on the next two. But what do you think would happen if we repeated Labov's study today? Right, this is in the 60s. And again, it had questionable methodology from a couple different perspectives. What do you think would happen if we did this again? Right now. Like, we flew out to New York. We can't because quarantine. But imagine that we did this, 4 months ago. We could have done it. What do you think would happen? Well, people actually did this. People have gone back since, 2 studies at least that I know of. Here's one by Fowler in 86, 20 years later, and another one by Mather in 2009, only 11 years ago. So, recent as far as these things go. What do you think they found? They actually appear to confirm Labov's standings by and large. But there appear to be correlations between the R-lessness versus R-fullness and variables like age, store, and race, socioeconomic class. In the 2009 study, they found that younger, so they're paying attention to more socio variables here. Already, right, you start to see the kinds of a spoiler alert precursor to the later waves of sociolinguistics, where Labov was doing he wanted to know about socioeconomic class. And that these more modern studies here, like this one in 2009, pays more attention to things like age and race. Still big categories, but at least more of them, right? And found that younger speakers pronounce R more frequently, have more R fullness than older speakers. This was different than it had been in the past. This is a new generational turnover thing. The upper and middle class speakers favor rhoticity, that's the R fullness, more than lower middle class informants. That's consistent with Labov's original findings. And in addition, African Americans overall use R-lessness more often than white speakers. But that even amongst African Americans with an increased level of R-lessness, there's still social stratification in the use of R, just like Labov found. Kind of interesting. Essentially, they're confirmed. They're updated. They're in a little bit more depth, and their methodologies are different. But by and large, they confirmed his theory. Okay, I'm actually going to cut it there. I'm shooting for slightly shorter videos here. I'm going to try and not go the full 50 minutes. Also, like I said, I have been talking more or less all day, so I'm going to stop doing that. We'll pick up with the second and third wave of sociolinguistics next time in our next lecture. That will probably be on Monday, because Friday is going to be our synchronous class, and I'm going to try not to lecture too much there. So some take-home points. Let's do a quick recap since we have a couple extra minutes here. Our recap is this. First, we looked at linguistic variation, and we saw that, there's variation within a language. Not all speakers of English, just because you speak English doesn't mean you speak identically. Me and you, listener, who hopefully understands English because that's what I'm speaking, we don't speak English the same, even if we grew up nearby each other. Next, we saw that sociolinguistics wants to utilize this linguistic variation and see its connections to social differences. It wants to look at the power of language and linguistic variation to index things about the speakers, so that when you speak in a certain way, it portrays you, it indexes you as a certain type of person. It doesn't make you a certain type of person, but it does lead people to perceive you as a certain type of person. From things like, regional differences in the United States, ethnic differences in the United States, socioeconomic class, and some more subtle things that we'll be looking at later. That's the power of indexicality, that language indexes you in a certain way. Then we started to break down how sociolinguistic studies were done. We looked at first wave sociolinguistics, which looks at, again, these big categories like we've been talking about. In the next class, we're going to be looking at more subtle, smaller, local variables. But for these studies, they're looking at big variables like race and socioeconomic class and gender. And lastly, that these first wave studies gave speakers less agency, right? That there was the idea of this vernacular that we weren't able to change over time. We weren't able to choose our vernacular. It was ingrained in us. We'll talk about that. I'm happy. I would love if we could get a good discussion going on Friday about the validity of this idea of an unchangeable vernacular. Because that doesn't, just because it's not like in vogue right now, doesn't mean that there's not some merit to that, right? So I'm happy to discuss both sides of that coin. And we looked at this really cool fourth floor, very famous sociolinguistic study by Bill Labov with questionable methodology, but fantastic findings. And he's got a good heart, so we'll forgive him this time. You're okay, 1966. So yeah, that's all I got for you today. I hope you're enjoying sociolinguistics. We have a lot more to cover within this. We have the obviously the 2 more waves that I've promised you, but even beyond that, we've got more material, and it gets real, right? So as a warning for what's coming up in sociolinguistics, we've been looking at a lot of variables, not a lot, the variables that we've seen up to this point are fairly benevolent. They're fairly benign, not benevolent, benign, in the sense that, in a boot indexing somebody as Canadian, it doesn't seem to have huge, meaningful ramifications socially and inequality in terms of justice and inequality. But that's not going to stay the case for long in sociolinguistics. We're very quickly going to see how these perceptions of indexicality and associations between stereotypes and linguistic variance turns and devolves into prejudice and racism, right? That's on the horizon for sociolinguistics, is looking at the role that language plays in the perception and even more so perpetuation of racism, because it plays a role. Think about that. If you would ruminate on this connection between prejudice, racism, and language, and we're going to arm ourselves with these sociolinguistic concepts such that we can better combat that injustice in our society. So it's this is your fair warning. This is your 2-minute warning that it's going to get real. And sort of prep yourself to be able to discuss these ideas of racism and prejudice. So probably that's not coming next class where we talk about these final 2 waves, but it will be coming the lecture thereafter. That being said, don't stress about it too much. Don't lose sleep. Stay safe, stay healthy during this quarantine. Lose sleep if you want. I mean, it's a serious issue. I said don't lose sleep like it's unimportant. It's very important, and we ought to be losing sleep about it, but I don't need you to lose all the sleep about it right now. I need the world to lose sleep about it in general. All right, I'll let you go. I'll stop rambling, and I'll catch you on Friday for an in-person class.